Progressive political commentator and author of the new book, The Populist Guide to 2020, Krystal went on CNN to talk a little bit about what she thinks Bernie Sanders needs to do if he wants to still win this thing. Let's take a look, then we'll talk about it.
And Krystal, and I want to make clear, you have not endorsed any candidate, but you are a progressive, and Bernie Sanders was someone you supported 4 years ago, and you've talked a lot in the last 24 hours, and I think it's really instructive about what you think the Sanders campaign in the center needs. What do they need to improve? They've done some things you think have been wrong and need to do better on if they want to secure this nomination.
Yeah, I think we have to be clear-eyed about the fact that they had one theory of the case, which is that you could expand the electorate enough to overcome, opposition from sort of the traditional Democratic voter. Now, Bernie Sanders has expanded the electorate with Latinos. He still has very high numbers with young people, which will be a critical piece of the general election. But he has not been able to bring enough voters in to make up for deficits in other areas. On the other hand, and this is the hopeful piece for people who like Bernie Sanders, he has found more receptivity with those traditional elements of the Democratic coalition than perhaps they expected. His favorability ratings are very high. Medicare for All and the Green New Deal and $15 minimum wage test incredibly well in every single state that we've seen. But people need a little bit of comfort that Bernie Sanders would be the person to defeat Donald Trump. He needs some friends. He needs some validators. He needs to be able to win that electability argument. And I think it is one that he can win. But that's where Elizabeth Warren does become important in this thing. Suburban voters are very comfortable with her. They like her. They liked her approach. They thought that she was someone who could be a strong candidate. So I think what she does could be incredibly significant if she were to back Bernie Sanders at this moment.
Is that how you see it, Paul?
Yes, in that he needs to stop this attack on the Democratic establishment, as if while running an ad with Barack Obama in it. You saw Congresswoman Demings endorsing Joe Biden and making the point that she's the daughter of a maid and a janitor. And now she's a powerful Congresswoman because she's worked hard and because the Democratic Party puts forward candidates like her. It's a big mistake. And he does need friends. Krystal's exactly. I hope they're listening to you, Krystal. That he needs. This is a team sport. And his slogan is not me, us, but still, it's kind of just him. And I would caution both of these candidates as they enter into what could be a death spiral, pull back from attacking motive and pull back from attacking other people's supporters. Biden has said this all along. It's part of his sort of political DNA. He learned that in the Senate, is that you can attack somebody's position. Don't attack their motive. But Joe Biden is not bought by corporate America. It's preposterous. And Bernie is a really good guy, and they shouldn't go at it. And I think it may be hard to get Elizabeth Warren's support to Bernie, not because they're that far apart on issues, but because there was that personal friction where Senator Warren believed that Bernie had called her a liar on national television. That's kind of hard to get past.
Back to earth.
Can I jump in on this, though, very quickly? Because this is an electability issue as well. I mean, we have to remember that Donald Trump is in the White House. Why? Because so many Americans were disgusted with the political establishment in D.C., and they bought his false promises that he was going to drain the swamp, and because he was a rich guy, he couldn't be bought. Look, it was all BS, but a lot of people believed that, and that was appealing. So Hillary Clinton took on water because she was seen as part of a corrupt establishment in D.C. That is a problem for Joe Biden. I mean, going back to Elizabeth Warren, think about the issue that she came into politics fighting. It was this bad bankruptcy bill that benefited credit card companies that Joe Biden was a champion of. He was called the senator from MBNA, a credit card issuer, because of his coziness with the credit card companies. I think it's a very important issue to litigate. They are running very different campaigns. There's a New York Times article saying, Wall Street's opening up their pocketbooks to Joe Biden. Health insurance stocks spiked when he had a good night. That says something about who the big corporate interests want to be in the White House. And I think that is a deeply important issue for Democratic primary voters, but also looking forward to the general election.
Now, the reason why I wanted to show you that clip is because for the past few days within the progressive movement, we've really been seeing two separate assessments after Super Tuesday arise in terms of what Bernie Sanders needs to do next if he wants to turn this thing around. On one side, you kind of have Krystal, Kyle Kulinski, and to some extent David Dole of the Rational National, arguing that, look, what Bernie needs to do is he needs to find some allies. He needs to find groups that he can work with in demographics, which he's been struggling with, in order to expand the electorate in the areas where he's been lagging in. The other side of things, kind of Jimmy Dore, Nico House, and then, also kind of Sahil of progressive voice to some extent, although a little bit less so. And then also I'd argue Sagar and Jetty, although he's more of a right-wing populist than a progressive. They're arguing, look, Bernie needs to go Sherman style. He needs to raise everything down. He needs to burn everything down. He needs to stop saying my friend Joe. He needs to stop saying that he'll support the eventual Democratic nominee, because, and their argument is, well, look, how can you say that you're an existential threat to the Democratic Party if you're going to turn around and just support whoever the nominee is? Contradiction in terms. So that's sort of their argument in terms of what they think. Now, the reason why this is really a relevant dispute in the first place is because when you look at the issues here, overwhelming support. Bernie Sanders, when it comes to Medicare for All, is like everyone agrees with him, right? So every single state poll so far. So Vermont, 73% support to 23% opposition. And you're like, well, hold on, Peyton. That's Vermont. Bernie Sanders is from Vermont. Obviously, they're going to say they support Medicare for all. Well, hold on. What about Texas? Texas, 63% support to 33% opposition. Texas, deep red supposedly, right? Texas. Democratic voters in Texas want Medicare for all. And all the early voting states as well. Everybody is like, yeah, I want Medicare for all. I agree with that. Now, you're like, well, hold on, Peyton. What's the framing? What's the framing? Because that can change things. Well, look at the framing here. The framing of the question is, do you want a government plan for all instead of private insurance? Guys, that's fair framing. Because it is true. You can frame things one way and get 10% support, frame it another way and get 90% support. It's all in the framing. But that's generally fair framing. That's genuinely fair framing. Now, it is true that some people might read that and then confuse that and think they're talking about a public option. But, I mean, there's probably a few people who confuse that. But generally, that's pretty fair framing. That's about as good framing as you're going to get when it comes to Medicare for all. And so clearly the dispute is because the positions are popular. So how do we get the voters to move that way? And look, here's my take on it, is I actually kind of agree with the Jimmy Dore burn everything down approach, but I think that's coming from a place of kind of Cartesian abstraction, right? That's if you're looking on from a place of an Archimedean point and you want to design the best progressive candidate who is going to, just go in, raise and get those progressive policies, you could argue that that would be the best way to do it. But on the flip side, I don't think that Bernie Sanders is the candidate who could do that. Like, Bernie's just too nice. He's just too nice to be able to do that. I think even if you manage to convince all of his advisors to just lock Bernie in a door and, just lock him in a room until Bernie, agrees to stop saying my friend Joe and, agrees to just completely just burn everything down or whatever. I just don't think Bernie would be able to do a good job at that. Now, that's not because Bernie isn't a good guy, or that's not because Bernie Sanders isn't, capable of it. It's just not, in his nature, right? Like, Bernie's just too nice, right? Like, have you ever, it's like trying to convince your best friend to, who's, a really, really nice person to, start yelling at people randomly, or that's a really weird example, but you get my point. It's just not in Bernie's nature. It's just not the thing that he's going to be able to do. Even if you manage to convince him, which I don't think that you would be able to convince him. I think he'd be like, no, he is my friend. I'm not going to stop saying that. Don't tell me what to do. I can't do a good Bernie, clearly. But even if you did manage to convince him, I don't think he would be able to pull it off effectively, especially at this point where Bernie has said endless times, yeah, I'll support the Democratic nominee. If Bernie Sanders were to then suddenly turn around and stop saying that, he'd suddenly start getting a bunch of negative media coverage. And you can criticize that and be like, well, hold on, why don't they do that to Joe Biden? That's fair. But guys, that's baked in. The media is going to be against Bernie. That's baked in at this point. So, it becomes a little bit like that. So my take on it is, while yes, I do think the Sherman style of things might work in the abstract, when we're trying to get Bernie Sanders elected, I don't think that that's the best approach. So I think that our time is better spent, our energy is better spent trying to think about ways that Bernie Sanders could reframe some of his issues in order to change the perception of things. Because, guys, this is what we're dealing with here. I found this picture and I absolutely love it. The perception of things is that Bernie Sanders is super far left. He's crazy. Nobody would want to vote for him, right? But the reality is that, actually Bernie Sanders is more so in the center because, again, look at the polls. Everybody agrees with him. At best, or at worst, I should say, Bernie Sanders is center left, right? But no, Bernie is actually on the money when it comes to the issues in terms of popular opinion. So I think that the question becomes, how do we make it so that then voters also recognize that Bernie Sanders is not crazy, that these ideas are popular, these ideas aren't going to lose you an election, because that's what everybody's worried about, right? They're worried about electability. And the mental model, which everybody's kind of, just running around with, is this normie mental model of, there's left and right, and then there's a center, and then voters are in the center, voters are on the left, voters are on the right, and then there's kind of a bell curve, and then, most voters are in the center, and so if you go too far left, you're unelectable. If you go too far right, you're unelectable. And so the best way to do it isn't to be in the center. You can criticize that. I have on this channel, I've criticized that a million times, that model. But that's the model. That's the mental model that people are walking around with. So you have to change the perception of how people perceive Bernie Sanders, even though they already agree with him in terms of the issue. So how do you do that? Well, I've thought of a few ways which Bernie Sanders could not pivot on the issues, but pivot on the rhetoric. One of the ways which Bernie Sanders could do when talking about Medicare for all, you say, well, look, my position is the moderate position. My position is the center position. Because first of all, as Bernie already does say, all the other countries have it. Everybody already does it. So how is it crazy if everybody already does it? Then what you say is, on one hand, you have the right-wing position, which is you want the private funding of private institutions, right? You want, just a private insurance cabal, and they're arguing with the doctors all the time when it comes to insurance. That's the right-wing position. Then on the left-wing position, you have the UK system, which is the public funding of public institutions. You have a public single-payer system going into public doctors, public hospitals, right? And then Medicare for all is the center position. Medicare for all is the moderate position, where you have the public funding of private institutions. You have the government, a single payer system, paying into all these private doctors and private hospitals. Medicare for all is the moderate position, right? You maybe you can polish up the way I said it a little bit, but generally you try to pitch it as, this isn't crazy. Guys, this isn't a crazy idea. Right? That's how you do it. That's how you get voters to be like, okay, this isn't crazy. This isn't radical. And actually, I agree. Turns out I agree. And that's how you would be able to get some of those suburban voters. Now, what about on some of the other issues? Because they always hit them on democratic socialism. You're a democratic socialist, you're a democratic socialist. And you can argue and be like, Bernie Sanders shouldn't have ever pitched himself as a democratic socialist. My take on that is, yes, strategically that's true. Although that doesn't mean that he's not like some people say, oh, well, you're not actually a democratic socialist because of your policies. That might be true. That might not be. Generally, I take it like if he says he's a democratic socialist, he's probably a democratic socialist. It's not like he doesn't know the difference in the labels. So, but anyway, that's a digression. But the way I would pitch it to Bernie is, because what does he always do? He always pivots to the policies that he's actually talking about. And that's good. And again, we need to pivot on some of the policies. But I also think that Bernie could just pivot and talk about how he thinks that, look, this is about taking back control of our country. Because, all these companies are just moving jobs overseas. All these companies, they're all interested in just shipping jobs off to China. You say, no, look, democratic socialism in terms of is about giving workers a say in their workplace. It's about taking back control of our lives, because all these companies, they just move in. Amazon, Facebook, Google, they move into all these communities. They they kill all these jobs. They take away all the mom and pop shops. They just completely change our country. You go, you move away from your hometown for 5 years and come back, and it's completely different. You don't even recognize the place anymore. Democratic socialism, Bernie should say, is, because again, he's already attached himself to the label at this point. He can't really back out of it at this point. You say, no, guys, this is just about taking back control of our communities. This is about giving workers a say, because you want to ship my job overseas? Okay, then I get a vote. It's about giving workers a vote when they want to ship your jobs overseas, or something like that. You can, again, polish up the rhetoric a little bit, but it's about taking control of our workplace. It's about taking control of our lives. And, when it comes, and same things, by the way, when it comes to kind of corporate finance of politicians. Because one of the things that I think his name was Paul was arguing in there is that Bernie needs to stop attacking the establishment. I don't know that I agree with that, because it is true that for some demographics, attacking the establishment is incredibly, incredibly popular. For other demographics who kind of see themselves as part of the establishment to some extent, it's not at all popular, right? So there's a little bit of a trade-off when it comes to attacking the establishment. And Krystal was absolutely right there to point out and criticize Paul and be like, look, attacking the establishment is going to happen in the general, so we might as well adjudicate it in the primary. But what I think Bernie Sanders could do in order to make it stop seeming to some people, because it's not, but some people perceive that as a personal attack, right? Some people are like, why are you attacking me when you're talking about corporate funding of you're making it seem like I'm bought. But if you actually listen, Bernie never really says, oh, you're bought. He says that, the elections are bought. But I think what Bernie can do is talk specifically about the way in which it's not just about corporations giving money and then politicians changing their position. Sometimes that happens. In fact, oftentimes that happens, right? And Joe Biden has even talked about, it's just human nature to change your position when they give you money and they're really nice to you. Joe Biden has said that. But also talk a little bit about how even if politicians don't change their minds, even if politicians don't change their positions on the issues, them giving you money makes it more difficult for you to lose re-election. What does that mean? It means that voters who want to rise up and primary you or even just challenge you in general, whether it's, whatever way it is, whether a primary or a general, it makes it more difficult, right? So corporations can look at your, say you support issue X when it comes to agriculture. This is your genuinely held belief. You're a politician. An agriculture business who sees that in their interest sends you corporate money. It makes it, and then, say the average voter, though, doesn't agree with that politicians, doesn't agree with your issue on that though, and then wants to challenge you. It becomes more difficult for them to primary you or challenge you in the general, however it is, because that company has sent you money. So it's not just about politicians changing their mind. That's some of it, for sure. But it's also just about the fact that corporations are getting more control of our lives in the way that, all these corporations coming from Silicon Valley, Facebook, Amazon, although Amazon's from Amazon's from Seattle. But regardless, all these corporations are coming from, one area of society, one upper class demographic, but they're able to enforce their values across the country. They're able to uproot the traditional values of local communities and make it so that local communities no longer have democratic control of their individual groups, right? It degrades democracy, right? Because these local areas who have their own positions, who have their own viewpoints based on, the sort of rooted of their tradition of growing up in their specific small town, their democratic views are less able to be sort of represented in Congress, right? So you have a Congress that has, the Washington consensus because that's the corporate consensus, right? Try to, I think Bernie Sanders would do a good job to try to tell that story. Tell the story of how the selling of elections, how the buying of elections, actually the issue isn't just, some abstract academic concern. It's also about you and your personal values in your small town not being able to be expressed. It's destroying small towns in the same way that Walmart moves in and then destroys all the mom and pop shops. It's the same way when it comes to politicians. I don't know, again, polish up the rhetoric, but I think that kind of approach, trying to change the perception, is, I think, Bernie Sanders' best bet when it comes to winning back, or not winning back, but winning the suburban voters, winning some of those voters who agree with him on policy, but are worried when it comes to the revolution, right? Because he's already got the revolutionaries. He's already got the democratic socialists like me, right? He's already got us. But he needs to expand the appeal because clearly young voters aren't coming out. Maybe he can tick it up a few points, but it seems at this point, like, if Bernie Sanders, who's getting these massive rallies, can't get the young voters to come out, maybe it is just an iron law of politics that young voters don't vote. Now, you can argue that some of that is economic issues. Young voters, maybe don't have the kind of ability to go out and vote because they're, doing different types of jobs, which, require whatever, or, whatever it is, right? There might be a million different reasons why. But young voters don't seem to be coming out to vote, right? So Bernie Sanders does, if he wants to win, he needs to expand his electorate in certain kinds of ways. And I think that the better way, our time is spent more productively thinking about ways that Bernie Sanders could pivot the rhetoric a little bit in order to expand his appeal into demographics that currently aren't supporting him. But anyway, if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.